So there are three types of empathy. There is cognitive empathy, which is your intellectual understanding. I would say it's almost like you know that this situation might be triggering. You do everything, you plan for how to avoid or to work through that situation, but still it arises and you don't end up acting in alignment with your intention, right? So that cognitive was the planning, that cognitive was the understanding, like all that stuff that when you read about and you understand the theory, you can almost put into action right away. The second type of empathy is somatic empathy. That's the felt experience. And part of that is intuition, like, okay, I've sensed there's tension in this room, or I can sense that the the rapport between you and I has shifted after a sentence has been said, right? But I don't know what to do with that.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dreamcatcher podcast, a place where your dreams can find a voice. I'm your host, Celine Chenoy. Thank you to all of you who return every week to tune in to become a better version of yourself. Make sure you hit subscribe if you haven't already, and rate our show if you enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone. I'm excited to announce the upcoming launch of my new book titled The Nomadic Soul, a seeker's guide to finding a sense of self and belonging in the modern world, which highlights a profound yet often unexplored part of your identity that holds the key to everything from answering your biggest questions to finding deeper meaning and joy in everyday life. Visit thenomadicsoulbook.com to learn more, download a free chapter, or to buy a copy. The capacity to establish empathic connections with others, that is, to feel with them, showing concern for their welfare, and demonstrating compassion, is critical to our lives. Yet several studies show that there's less empathy in the world than previous decades. But my guest, Michael Tennant, believes that learning to care more about each other is a skill that all of us can learn and master. Today, he'll share more about the power of empathy to inspire personal growth and social change. Michael Tennant is an award-winning media, advertising, and nonprofit veteran from companies like MTV, Vice Media, P&G, Coca-Cola, and Google. In the 2000s, he sat front seat to the rise of Vice, today's leading voice in millennial media, and brought with him a dedicated approach to long-term authentic community building. He is also the founder and CEO of Curiosity Lab, a purpose-driven venture studio and consultancy that builds products and experiences that teach empathy. During our conversation, Michael will describe what it means to be an empathetic person and how we can infuse compassion into everything that we do, both in our personal and professional life. He'll also share some techniques and actionable frameworks that will transform these values into a consistent day-to-day practice. Hey, Michael, how are you doing today?
Hey, Celine, how are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. I appreciate you making the time to be here on our podcast to discuss the power of empathy, which I think is a really, really important and pertinent topic in today's world. Given the conflict and ideological differences that we're seeing everywhere, not just in the United States, I think it's really, really essential for us to learn how to connect and really understand where people are coming from so that we can at least find a middle ground. And I think that really happens when we're able to tap into our empathy. What are your thoughts on that? Do you also see it as being something that is really essential, especially right now in the times we're living in?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of talk and discussion and aspiration around how we can use empathy to reach that middle ground and to come together. And I think the way I've addressed and explored the empathy and the power of empathy is actually a part that we don't talk about enough, which is that it's really hard emotional work to hear someone's opinion or to face something that's very counter from your point of view of how it should go or how it is, and to stay in there and to stay open. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how we get better at noticing, recognizing, labeling, being with our emotions, especially when it's hard. And we need that ability now more than ever, not just with the division that we are experiencing around the world, but also as we're witnessing a rising mental health crisis around the world. I think they're directly related. When we're not able to connect with one another as well as we used to in the past, it creates a disconnect. But also when we're living through our lives, realizing that we have to avoid parts of our lives, parts of our emotions, it actually helps to exacerbate the mental health situation that we may not otherwise be experiencing.
Hmm. And what do you think is the root cause for that? Why do you feel like we are getting increasingly disconnected from our emotions?
I think I think that it's always been something that we have done as a mode of survival. It's not new for us to um, use entertainment or to use sometimes uh, various forms of distraction from partying to even dating sometimes uh, to escape what otherwise we would have to face if we were equipped to face those emotions. So I want to just like honor that it's always been a part of our condition when it's hard sometimes to avoid that, right? We need to have that kind of compassion for ourselves to do the work to come together. But it definitely has been amplified by social media, the ability to exchange information, the ability to interact with each other sometimes anonymously. Um, it puts this crisis of already uh, being disconnected from our emotions and expressing ourselves in constructive ways, and it puts it in an unregulated hyper chamber,
That's true. Yeah.
you know? And
Do you
so
feel that it's also because of lack of education when it comes to handling our emotions? Because this is not something we're taught in schools. I mean, if we're lucky, we had parents or caretakers who guided us and made us aware of our inner world. But I feel like we as a society are severely lacking in that respect, where we don't educate the youth about how to handle their feelings and process them. I mean, I certainly experienced that growing up, and it's emotional intelligence is something that I had to learn as a young adult.
me too. Me too. I was starting to, especially I would say around 2020, 2021, feel really optimistic. I mean, my viewpoint is very US centric. That's where I have the most knowledge. And so, I was beginning to learn more about social emotional learning and how that was being dispersed throughout the education system, particularly in places where there, schools that had more resources that could invest in that level of education, not, equal in all school districts or in all schools, even within districts. Um, it certainly was absent. I'm in my I was about to say 30s. I just turned 40. So it certainly
Oh, okay,
was
so we're the same age.
absent. Oh, okay. I would have never guessed that. It uh, certainly wasn't present in adolescent education in the United States, and I'd imagine in many parts of the world in the 80s and the 90s. Um, so, the parents who have young children now, most of us, again, I turn back to like just offering grace and compassion to everyone, right? Most of us weren't uh, taught that. If anything, we were taught that expressing emotions, experiencing emotions was weakness. It was maybe rude in some cases, particularly when going across generations to have that honest exchange with our adults. I come from a Jamaican background, so some of my ideals are even, let's say, the ones that were introduced to me by my parents, rather, which aren't necessarily my values and my ideals now, did not create an environment to explore. So I would say both in education, it has been lacking. It's been promising to see a lot more discussion. I was just actually spending time with the U.S. Surgeon General report, which is actually hitting on three of the four key areas of that we dive into when we're applying empathy, which are workplace well-being, youth mental health, and social connection, which we touched on here too. But in this current politically polarized state, words like empathy and social emotional learning have actually become what might be considered like almost what we call dog whistles, code for people with very, I would say, on the right, very far right here, like things like mental health, which globally are recognized as topics of importance, are now sort of villainized as kind of
Yeah.
left leaning
I've heard a lot of
liberal
conservative
topics.
podcasters really, they definitely look at it with suspicion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that is permeated into education. So I grew up in New York. I moved to Florida and became a Florida resident in 2022. So I'm in my second full year here, and I've just been witnessing almost, I would say, some of the most amplified examples of that. And it certainly, their schools have had to change language if they want to provide this necessary support to their students. They have to call it something different than social emotional learning to have it continue forward. Um, and so, yeah, we're kind of, and we've gone some steps forward and many steps backwards in many ways. And, just to wrap up a point. So even in situations where kids are getting that educational exposure, most often their parents, perhaps the job environments that are still being led by Gen Xers and millennials who didn't have that training are absent of a lot of that training as well. So it's almost a
Mhm.
cycle of re-traumatization, if you will, if we don't
Yeah.
have a all hands approach.
Right. And it seems like you're intimately aware of this whole learning process because you yourself have been on that journey of really trying to understand how you feel and getting in touch with those emotions and really unearthing the empathy within you. So why don't we talk about the inspiration behind the book, The Power of Empathy, and everything that you do today? Uh, give us some background information about what were the life events that led up to what you do today.
Yeah, I'll try to give a succinct version of it. But I will say that a lot of I was about to go into a lot of the internal work first, but I'd say the catalyst into getting more curious about empathy and even what bookends how to then apply the individual work that I did to get more aware of and more positive ways of dealing with my emotions to then channel that into now how do I get that out into the world. It really started in 2016. It started with was like after the election year in 2016, I decided that even though I had spent the years of my life mostly in entertainment and in consumer products, that I no longer wanted to wake up one morning and feel like I'd been on the sidelines and not used any of my time and my energy towards something more purposeful, something that would leave a legacy, not a material legacy, but something that leaves an impact on our our species, if you will, to be that ambitious. In 2016, also that year, my closest older brother had a stroke. So, when we're young and we're youthful and sometimes just like chasing our ambition, we can lose sight of how fleeting life can be. And I would say that was the point in my life where I started to realize I had a wake up call, and that many of us will have at some point, most of us, all of us, most likely. So at that point, I started to want to make sure that that the work that I was doing, creating world-class marketing campaigns for multinational brands in various categories, that all of that, like 80% of my time and my energy and the stress that came along with it, that I was actually taking that same energy investment and putting it towards things that mattered to me. And a year later, I created Curiosity Lab and left corporate advertising. After trying to navigate how to spend more time with family and my brother who survived that stroke, and then had to almost like battle with my boss, that boss who she was so committed to just the job and not to the individual, which is, I think, something that's shifting. Created Curiosity Lab, left corporate advertising, had 2 years of ups and downs as an entrepreneur. And was in a down period in 2019, just before the pandemic. Put the job more into, say, a hobby category for a moment, and took employment as a chief marketing officer of a nonprofit, navigating the ego of putting your entrepreneurship aside, which is a thing. And we talk about that in empathy too. But that same summer, I ended up losing that brother, Chris, and losing another brother that year as well. So essentially, that was a kind of emotional rock bottom where I learned that I'd spent my 30s escaping through achievement and work and escaping emotions through the entertainment and the partying that I kind of alluded to earlier. And realized that if I continued down that path, I'd probably join my brothers sooner than I thought. So that's important, because that was my wake up call. That was my moment where I decided that I could no longer live in a life where I stayed on the surface level, or when something really challenging of sadness or anger or fear or shame even showed up, that I escaped. If I continued down that path, there would be no more. And really, that ended up being the inspiration that arrived in my life during the pandemic and during the racial uprising. Quite frankly, a lot of the healing that I needed to do to survive losing my brothers allowed me to look at the pain that we all were experiencing, and the shift in life and shift in habits and shift in behavior and shift in privileges and access that we were all looking at. I was able to look at that with a bit of distance, because a lockdown, frankly, as a Black man growing up in America, the racial uprising was just like another of a cycle of things that happens every 5 or 7 years or so. So it wasn't really necessarily, it was painful, but it wasn't new. And so all of those combined experiences and the healing that I was able to do that summer allowed me to kind of look at it at a distance and be able to see the pain of a great many people. people who had their way of life being challenged, people who had differing views from me, and to say, well, you know what, there's a commonality here. There are challenging emotions showing up here that you don't know how to be with and this and to label and to stick through and to stay here in order to realize your purpose. For me, that showed up when I lost brothers. So like for some people here, showing up as privilege is being challenged. For others, it's showing up wanting their voice to be heard, right? But the commonality was that we all could get some support getting that education that was missing from our adolescence and missing from our systems that teach us how to actually notice and be with emotions. And so I think anger anger is an emotion that I allow myself to be more inspired by than a lot of people give themselves permission to. And instead of being angry that that education was missing, I used it to inspire, like moving from theory, moving from just speaking about empathy and putting it into something that we could actually learn or process.
Great. Michael, thank you for sharing the story. I'm very sorry to hear about your loss. But it's encouraging to know that you used it as a catalyst and as a way to transform you and also to realize your purpose. And what I find particularly inspirational is how you were able to understand the different shades of emotions, particularly empathy, because those experiences forced you to really look at it in a way that you haven't before. So, what do you think that people get wrong about empathy? Because it's a word that's thrown around a lot, and it's
Yeah.
often
Oh, yeah.
confused with sympathy. So,
Yeah.
for all our listeners who, they're hearing the word, but they're not quite sure what exactly it entails, can you give us a
Yeah.
definition of empathy and what that really looks like?
Well, I love that you brought up the word sympathy because I think that's what many people, especially those who might be a little bit fatigued, feel fatigued that they don't know label yet by the word empathy, is that they immediately think of it as a word that means an obligation to provide sympathy no matter what, right? And so when I suggest that we all would benefit from being empathetic, and people then insert, okay, you're suggesting that we would all benefit from being unconditionally sympathetic in all cases, then you understand why people might have a resistance to empathy. The way that I define empathy is it is a set of practices and tools that allow you to greater attune to your emotional awareness and to use that awareness in how you respond to individuals and situations. So there's a lot more agency than this obligation to even sometimes give of yourself when you don't want to give compassion to an individual that you don't align with. I think that's different than being willing to try to understand their perspective. It's also different than being willing to understand the emotional quality that shows up as you have a differing opinion with another person, right? It's more like, let's take the intelligence that emotions gives us and use it proactively than it is an obligation to provide sympathy or to put yourself unconditionally in another person's shoes.
Okay. Can you give us an example of how can that can play out?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I want to create an example that is very tangible and relatable. Um, and the example that is coming to me is thinking about having differing views with my parents on a topic. And I love my parents. And I want to have a good time when I visit them. They live an hour away. I don't go all that often. I want it to be good. So I know a long term in any interaction that I have with them, I want to leave in a place of harmony, right? But I also want them to understand my point of view and I want to move them toward me as much as I can. I want them to understand how their points of views might be um, colored by experiences and a past that may not be as relevant now. So I know my why, I know the conditions, I know where I need to go, but I also know that we're very far apart on some topics. So there you just heard me being able to, in advance of engaging with myself, put myself in their shoes. I know where they stand on the topic. I've put myself in my own shoes, present and future. I know how I want this to land, but also I've spent a bit of time thinking about my values and why it's important for me to not just move to their side, why I need to stay on my side per se. Now let's have a discussion. Um, I know that in some cases I'm going to be very indirect with them. I'm going to ask them questions. I'm going to allow them to share their point of view. I may actually ask them about situations when they were younger and when they may have related more to my point of view today. What I'm not going to do is tell them you need to here's my point of view and you need to agree with it or else I'm done. I'm not going to put a line in the sand. I'm not going to create an ultimatum. Does that land for you? What,
Yeah,
how,
so it sounds like you come from a place of curiosity and and the fact that you have that awareness about yourself and what your values are, and also you know your parents well. You did, I mean, they're your parents, right? So having that knowledge about who you're dealing with, whether it's an individual or a group or an organization, I think that would also help, right, in being able to really understand where they're coming from and, being able to put yourself in their shoes, right?
yeah, I think familiarity certainly helps. I
Yeah.
think knowing and being rooted in your purpose and your outcome, where you want to go, helps you stay grounded even as emotions may shift and show up
Hmm.
in the exchange. I think there are ways that we all in business, we close familiarity gaps. We use whatever research or intelligence or maybe even an advanced conversation with someone in order to close the knowledge gaps if it's that important to us, which then comes back to that purpose again. Is this so important that I'm willing to invest that energy ahead of time to make sure this conversation goes as well as possible?
Mm.
That's what happens when we bring in a professional mediator to close the gaps because it's so important that we have to bring in money now and a professional to
Yes.
help close that gap. Yeah.
And do you think that's something that we could do on our own without the mediator? And if so, how?
You
Okay.
strengthen your skill sets at regulating your emotions because you're actually practicing noticing, putting yourself in situations where you're agitating your emotions. You can notice and you can choose. It's almost like going to the gym ahead of
Mm.
time. So you're learning how to strengthen your emotional proficiency so you can act like a mediator for yourself on your behalf, on the behalf of others, right? But then you're also learning how emotions show up in group settings, in individuals, how that shows up in body language, you know, by opening your curiosity about how emotions show up in body language in others, but then using yourself as the test case, like you always have yourself, right? Like, what happens when you're watching a TV or a movie and suspense shows up, right? That tells you how fear reacts in your body.
Hmm.
You know, a memory in your past where anger showed up. And if you sit with yourself and say meditate on that moment, you could almost put yourself emotionally back in that situation and see
Yeah.
how your body reacted, right?
Yeah. Yeah, especially if you're dealing with somebody who triggers you or just a difficult person. I think that's where it gets challenging.
Yeah. It seems like you might almost even have a situation that popped up in mind that you thought of.
Not really, nothing specific, but in my experience, that's when I find it the hardest to be
Yeah.
empathetic because it happened more in the past. I would get triggered and be like, "No, I don't agree with you, and you should listen to me."
Yeah.
But over time, as you get more mature, you realize that coming from a place of curiosity is a lot more constructive.
Yeah. But it's also good to like understand the science of what happens there, right? So, okay, so there are three types of empathy. There is cognitive empathy, which is your intellectual understanding. I would say it's almost like you know that this situation might be triggering. You do everything you plan for how to avoid or to work through that situation, but still it arises and you don't end up acting in alignment with your intention, right? So that cognitive was the planning. That cognitive was the understanding, like all that stuff that when you read about and you understand the theory, you can almost put into action right away. The second type of empathy is somatic empathy. That's the felt experience. And part of that is intuition, like, okay, I've sensed there's tension in this room, or I can sense that the the rapport between you and I has shifted after a sentence has been said, right? But I don't know what to do with that. In fact, I actually feel less clear than I did before because of that shift. You know, that intelligence is real. It's how we communicate non-verbally, right? But it also, knowing that that exists, it helps you to understand why we might not be as clear when we get triggered. Our cognition, our intellectual ability to process at that moment has been overridden by our emotions, right? And we might actually have noticed that in our bodies, and we may have been able to slow that situation down or learn some practices that allow us to make sure that we remain present and able to act, which then leads us to the third type of empathy, which is effective empathy. It's being able to have knowledge of emotions and to use it intellectually, being able to notice the emotional quality and notice it showing up physically. But I say the key thing in effective empathy is knowing when you need to lower your ego.
That's a big
And
one.
I think that's a part that that many people don't talk about enough is like when those emotions show up, when we're triggered, when our cognition is not working as well, what does work well is our ego. Our ego then steps up and says, I have this, right? And so that split second shift that happens when all of a sudden we're no longer strategically approaching this discussion, but rather are defensively or yeah, I'd say defensive is probably a really good word for it. Defensively approaching this discussion, that is our ego at play. But we'll never notice that because that is a self defense unless we train to notice that. So, I mean, I like the word that you use, curiosity. One way to enhance our curiosity is to be willing to find our ego and even like turn it into a game. Like, no, I'm not, it's not as certain as I thought even a second ago than that I thought it was. And that is a way of that is my ego being present here.
Mm, great. Thank you for breaking that down for us, the three types of empathy. I also wanted to mention that these skill sets also help when we're dealing with people from other cultures and different subcultures, other races, because I recently traveled to Egypt, and Egypt has a very distinct culture. What I did to prepare myself is I always like try to read about the culture before I get there and to kind of know what I would be dealing with. Uh, and I think doing that preparation, knowing how a foreigner like me would be received over there, and the most effective and compassionate way to communicate with them so that I would bridge that gap of differences between us. I feel that really, really helps. And I think having empathy would make you a more compassionate traveler, and you would also be having more fulfilling conversations with the locals. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that just came to mind as you were speaking.
Yeah, I love that you took some time to talk about some of the uplifting and joyful benefits of doing this work. I mean, even you doing that research ahead of time, that's work, that's energy, that's time, right? It's not
Yeah.
necessarily easy, but it allowed you to connect quicker.
Yes.
Um, I think travel is a great example. An important application is doing business across cultural lines. That can be international, that can be even within our, national borders.
Yeah.
The way that a New Yorker does business, and I had to learn this the hard way when I went to work for a company that had a more West Coast vibe than a New York vibe. That assertiveness that you sort of speak up shows up as a difference. Maybe like it's assertive in a different way, than we would be in New York. Sometimes our language is a bit blunt and overly
Hmm.
direct.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that something that I've recently noticed as a business leader is that I had a bias toward. I do still have a bias. I'm working on undoing this bias, but I have a bias towards people who communicate like me and who um, even like process ideas the same way that I do. And as a result, I tend to not hire um, operationally minded people or say type A operators that I could use as support alongside me, alongside my creativity and willingness to kind of work in the abstract. So again, even you can see how curiosity or a curiosity is being willing to find those blind spots and how they get in the way of our growth. Um, but also to see those how we might just like skip over those patterns without even knowing.
Right. So you were kind of, there was a bit of mirroring happening over there, right?
Yeah, definitely some mirroring and bringing in people in the room that like to pontificate about ideas rather than putting them into tangible action plans.
All right, Michael. So before I let you go, I have one final question. And, for people listening who have their eye on a particular community, a group, or even a person for which they are feeling that sense of empathy and they want to do something to help and to make a difference, what are the steps that they can take to begin that journey and to
Yeah,
actually be a force for good?
yeah. Well, I'll try and map it against the five phases of empathy in my book. And the first thing I would say is, phase one, the language of feelings. Start to understand the emotions that show up in you when you imagine the challenges that you're going to face going forward. And you can even do some of that curiosity ahead of time, even just on your own by becoming more familiar with where you might come out of your intentions. Phase two is the importance of intentions. Really ground yourself in your why. Why are you approaching this conversation? Why are you taking on the challenge of bridging this gap? If you are grounded in your why, then and you're aware of what's showing up in your emotions, then you have what it takes to come back when it's hard, or even to come back if you mess up. and to be willing to approach that breach of trust building, with a low ego, because you know where you're headed, you know why you're there. Um, Phase three, channeling purpose. Really, really think about what you control. You can't control how people react to what you share, but you can control what you share. You can control your words. You can be mindful of going slow. You can do things in advance that create the container for a trust building conversation. So just be really mindful of what you control and having a short attention span for the things that you don't. Phase four, from empathy to impact. Think about the environment. Think about where it is that you're having this discussion. Is it a place where that person is going to be most equipped to also lower their ego and to join you, to mirror you? Are there are there things that you need to let go of before you go into that discussion, that beliefs about that person that you need to be willing to let go of? So just really thinking about the environment, and is it public? Is it private? Is this something that you should do in a group setting? Is it something that you should do in a smaller setting? All of these things matter. And then finally, I would say, is phase five, living with abundance. And a part of that is being willing to uh, being willing to come back, being willing to get it wrong, being willing to look at a timeline in an extended way versus a short way. Think of all the ways that we can commit to a positive outcome and finding the blocks and eliminating them.
Wonderful. Michael, thank you for giving us an overview of those 5 steps. And I just want to let our listeners know, if you want to know about that framework in detail, and if you want to know about the other things that he writes about in his wonderful book, The Power of Empathy, a 30-day path to personal growth and social change, you can find his book wherever books are sold, and on Michael's website, curiositylab.io. The links will be in the description.